Emma Brooks had always prided herself on being in control. As a driven, intelligent college student, she never imagined that a secret affair with her married professor, Roland Wright, would spiral into a web of manipulation, betrayal, and danger. But as their relationship grew more intense, Emma found herself trapped in a dangerous game, one that would cost her everything. Secrets would be exposed, hearts shattered, and lives forever changed as she tried to navigate the fine line between love, ambition, and obsession. Dr. Roland Hale was a man of influence, respected by his colleagues and admired by his students. At 45, he had built an academic career that most would envy, specializing in philosophy at Blackwood University. His lectures were captivating, often leaving students in awe of his deep understanding of complex ideas. With his neatly combed hair, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, and perfectly tailored suits, he carried himself with an air of sophistication. His charisma extended beyond his professional success, and many of his students found themselves drawn to him, captivated by both his knowledge and his presence. Roland was married to Lila Hale, a quiet woman who had been by his side for more than 15 years. Lila, a fellow academic, was well respected in her own field, but had always been in the shadow of Roland's towering reputation. The couple had 2 children, a son in high school and a daughter in middle school. From the outside, they appeared to lead the ideal life, a successful, intellectual family with everything in place. But behind closed doors, there were cracks in the perfect facade. Roland's long hours at the university, his intense focus on his research, and his absence from home were beginning to strain his marriage. Lila, though still deeply in love with her husband, had started to feel neglected and lonely. She was aware of his demanding work schedule, but there was a growing sense of distance between them that she could no longer ignore. Emma Langley was a student at Blackwood University, new to the campus and eager to prove herself. At 20, she was ambitious, intelligent, and curious. She had chosen philosophy as her major, drawn to the subject's depth and complexity. Her passion for the subject was undeniable, but what truly set her apart was the way she saw the world. Emma asked questions that others hadn't thought of, and she often challenged the ideas presented in class with a critical mind that wasn't afraid to dive into difficult discussions. It was no surprise that she caught Dr. Hale's attention. He had noticed her from the first day of class, intrigued by her ability to engage with material that most of his students found dry or overly complex. Their first interaction was brief but telling. After a lecture on ethical theory, Emma approached Dr. Hale with a question about a concept he had just introduced. Her inquiry wasn't simply academic. It was thoughtful, probing, and showed an understanding of the material that went beyond memorization. Roland, impressed by her intellect, agreed to meet her after class to discuss the topic further. Their conversation was innocent at first, an academic exchange about a challenging subject, but as the weeks passed, their encounters became more frequent. Emma sought Roland's advice on assignments and her research. Roland, in turn, seemed eager to mentor her, offering detailed feedback and discussing her ideas with a level of attention he didn't give to other students. There was something magnetic about their connection. Emma's youthful enthusiasm mixed with Roland's worldly experience. One afternoon, Roland invited Emma to his office for a private discussion about her thesis proposal. They sat across from each other at his desk, the room dimly lit by a single desk lamp. The conversation drifted from academics to more personal matters. Emma spoke about her struggles adapting to university life, about her family back home, and her hopes for the future. Roland listened attentively, offering words of encouragement and support. His demeanor was warm and genuine, yet there was an underlying tension that neither of them acknowledged. As they spoke, Emma noticed the way Roland's gaze lingered on her, the way his voice softened when he addressed her directly. It wasn't just a mentor-student relationship, it was something more complicated, though neither was willing to admit it. As the semester continued, their meetings became more regular. Roland offered Emma guidance not just on her studies but also on her life outside the classroom. He gave her advice on her personal aspirations, recommended books that went beyond the scope of her coursework, and even suggested she attend a philosophy conference he would be speaking at. Emma, eager to please and hungry for knowledge, accepted his invitations without hesitation. She admired Roland's intellect and found herself looking forward to their time together, even though a small, nagging voice in her head told her that something wasn't entirely right. Still, she justified it to herself. After all, Roland was a respected professor, and his advice could only help her. Roland, for his part, found Emma's admiration intoxicating. She was young, vibrant, and eager to learn, a stark contrast to the weary routine of his marriage. Lila, his wife, had become distant in her own way, caught up in the responsibilities of raising children and managing the home. Roland had tried to make time for his family, but his passion for his work often left little room for emotional intimacy. Emma filled a void he hadn't realized was growing. She was a reminder of youth and possibility, someone who was still shaping her worldview, still open to influence. Roland found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't expected. The attraction between them remained unspoken, lingering in the air like a dangerous secret. Neither Emma nor Roland acknowledged the growing tension, but as the weeks went by, it became increasingly difficult for both to ignore. What had begun as a professional relationship was slowly beginning to transform into something else, something that neither of them could control. Emma felt conflicted, torn between her admiration for Roland and the ethical boundaries she knew she was crossing. Roland, though aware of the risks, couldn't seem to resist. The stage was set for a dangerous and life-altering affair, one that would soon unravel in ways neither could foresee. As the weeks went by, Roland and Emma's relationship began to evolve in subtle ways. What had started as a simple student-teacher dynamic slowly morphed into something more complex, a bond that neither of them fully understood or wanted to confront. Roland continued to guide Emma in her studies, but their private conversations began to wander into areas outside of academia. Emma would find herself spending more time in Roland's office than necessary, lingering after their discussions about her assignments, as if the academic content was secondary to the emotional connection they were developing. Their meetings were always framed by the pretense of academics. Roland would suggest they meet to discuss her latest paper, or perhaps a question she had raised in class. But each time they spoke, the air grew thicker with unspoken words. Roland's attention toward Emma became more personal, even tender. He would compliment her on her insights, but there was a tone in his voice that Emma couldn't quite place. Something that felt more intimate than professional. She began to notice how he would lean in slightly when speaking to her, how his eyes seemed to linger a little longer than was appropriate. At first, Emma brushed it off, telling herself that he was simply a charismatic professor who had a way of making students feel special. But as the moments stretched longer, she couldn't ignore the way her heart would race whenever he smiled at her or asked her to stay after class to talk. Roland, for his part, found himself increasingly captivated by Emma's presence. She was smart, confident, and refreshingly genuine. She didn't fawn over him like some of the other students, and that only made him more intrigued. What began as admiration for her intellectual curiosity soon grew into something else, something more primal. He found himself looking for excuses to spend time with her outside of class, subtly orchestrating opportunities for them to meet. They would chat after lectures, in the halls, or even in the quiet corners of the university library. Roland would walk with her to her next class or offer to help her with research questions. These moments, seemingly innocent on the surface, were building a bridge between them, one that neither of them could easily cross back over. As the days turned into weeks, Emma started to notice that her grades were improving at a remarkable rate. Her essays, which had once been marked with critiques, were now praised for their insight and depth. Roland's feedback was not just constructive, it was glowing. Her peers took notice of the changes as well, and some began to comment on how much more attention she seemed to be receiving from Roland compared to the other students. Emma tried to push aside any uncomfortable thoughts, convincing herself that her hard work was finally paying off, that her newfound understanding of philosophy was the true reason behind the improvement. But deep down, she knew something wasn't quite right. Roland's influence over Emma continued to grow, as did his possessiveness. He would often reach out to her with emails and texts, asking how she was doing, suggesting books to read, or offering to meet up to discuss her progress. At first, Emma was flattered by his attention. He was, after all, one of the most respected professors at Blackwood University. His opinion carried weight, and his approval meant everything to her. But the messages started to come more frequently, and they were no longer solely academic. Roland would ask about her personal life, inquire about her family, and even suggest they meet for coffee to talk about things other than school. He would comment on her appearance, subtle remarks about her clothing, her smile, the way she carried herself. These comments made her uneasy, though she didn't have the words to explain why. Emma's friends began to notice the shift in her behavior. She started spending more time alone, retreating into her own thoughts. Nora, one of Emma's closest friends, was the first to voice her concerns. She noticed Emma's distracted demeanor and the way she would often glance nervously at her phone, as if waiting for Roland's next message. Nora asked her if everything was okay, but Emma brushed it off, insisting that Roland was simply a mentor, someone who was helping her navigate the complexities of university life. But Nora wasn't convinced. She had seen how Roland acted toward Emma, the way his eyes would follow her when she entered a room, how his tone would change when he addressed her. It wasn't just mentorship, it was something else entirely. But Emma didn't want to admit it, not even to herself. The emotional tension between Roland and Emma continued to grow. What had begun as a harmless student-professor relationship was now clouded by an undeniable attraction. Emma's feelings toward Roland were becoming confusing. Part of her was flattered by the attention, yet another part of her felt deeply uncomfortable. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing herself in this relationship, that she was no longer the same person who had first come to the university full of ambition and excitement. She had begun to rely on Roland's approval more than her own sense of self-worth, and that scared her. Roland, too, found himself caught in a dangerous web. He had always been in control, both in his career and in his personal life, but with Emma things felt different. He was no longer the mentor guiding a student. He was the one being pulled into something far more complicated. He told himself that his feelings for her were harmless, that it was simply a matter of admiration for her intellect. But the truth was harder to deny with each passing day. The lines between professional and personal had blurred, and neither Roland nor Emma knew how to untangle themselves from the mess they had created. The affair was already beginning to take root, and soon it would be too late to turn back. As time passed, Emma found herself more and more entangled in the web of her relationship with Roland. At first, she had convinced herself that it was just a harmless connection, a mentor-student dynamic that had grown a bit closer than it should have. But deep down, she could no longer deny that what they shared was something much more complicated. Roland's influence over her had deepened, and the lines between their academic exchanges and personal interactions had become nearly impossible to distinguish. Emma had always prided herself on her ability to maintain control over her emotions, but Roland's presence was starting to feel suffocating. His messages had become more frequent, and his attention was overwhelming at times. He would text her late at night, sometimes about trivial things, like what she thought of a recent class discussion, or if she had any thoughts on a new theory he had read. But other times his messages veered into more personal territory, asking how she was feeling or commenting on how beautiful she looked that day. Emma couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of flattery and discomfort whenever he would send these texts. She had started questioning whether this was something she was truly comfortable with, or if she had simply become too dependent on his approval. At the same time, Emma had grown closer to Ethan Ross, a fellow student she had met at the start of the semester. Ethan was smart, funny, and genuinely kind, a contrast to the intense and often controlling nature of Roland's attention. Emma had initially resisted the idea of dating anyone, feeling that her academic career was her priority, but as she spent more time with Ethan, she began to feel something she hadn't in a long time. A genuine connection. He made her feel normal again, as though the weight of Roland's influence could be set aside, if only for a few hours. They started spending more time together outside of class. Coffee dates, long walks around the campus, and quiet study sessions in the library. With Ethan, Emma felt lighthearted and at ease, free from the pressure she had come to associate with Roland. But Roland was growing more and more possessive. He had noticed Emma's increasing distance and the way she seemed distracted in their private meetings. He sensed that something had shifted, but he wasn't ready to let go of her so easily. When Emma missed a few of their meetings, Roland became irritated. He would show up unexpectedly at her office hours or drop her a text asking why she hadn't been responding to his messages. His patience had worn thin, and his concern for her academic progress had shifted into something darker, a sense of entitlement over her time and attention. Emma, increasingly uncomfortable, tried to find ways to balance her relationship with Roland and her growing feelings for Ethan. She had begun to pull away from Roland, but every time she did, he would find a way to reel her back in. He would send her thoughtful, encouraging emails, complimenting her on her recent work or offering advice on her personal life. At times, his words were laced with a subtle manipulation, reminders of how much he had helped her, how much her success depended on his guidance. The more she tried to distance herself, the more she felt caught in his grasp. The strain on Emma grew as she found herself torn between the two men in her life. Ethan was kind and attentive, but she couldn't ignore the power dynamics in her relationship with Roland. What had started as mentorship now felt like a trap, one that she didn't know how to escape. Ethan noticed the change in her too. She had become distant, more preoccupied than ever, and he couldn't help but wonder if she was still emotionally available to him. He didn't know what was going on behind the scenes with Roland, but he sensed something wasn't right. One evening he confronted Emma, gently asking if everything was okay. She brushed it off, saying she was just stressed with her studies, but Ethan wasn't convinced. Behind her efforts to keep things normal, Emma was battling with guilt. Guilt for what she had allowed Roland to do, guilt for how close she had gotten to Ethan while still carrying the weight of Roland's attention. She was conflicted, unable to fully acknowledge the consequences of her relationship with Roland and the way it was slowly chipping away at her sense of self. She had told herself that she was in control, that she could handle it, but deep down she was beginning to realize that Roland had more power over her than she was willing to admit. Roland, too, was struggling with his emotions. He was used to being in control, to having his desires fulfilled without question, but with Emma, things felt different. He had spent years building a reputation as a respected professor, a man of intellect and influence, and yet with Emma, he felt a vulnerability he wasn't used to. He tried to justify his actions by convincing himself that it was nothing more than an emotional connection, that his feelings for her were based on admiration for her intellect and potential. But as the lines blurred, he realized that his attachment to her was growing stronger, and it was no longer just about academic guidance. It was about something more, something he couldn't control. In the midst of all this, Emma found herself questioning everything. She had always prided herself on her independence and her ability to make her own decisions, but now she felt like she was at the mercy of two opposing forces: Roland's manipulative hold and Ethan's genuine affection. She didn't know how to break free from either of them, or even if she wanted to. The more she tried to distance herself from Roland, the more he seemed to pull her back in, and the more she grew close to Ethan, the more she feared the consequences of her secret life being exposed. The tension between Roland, Emma, and Ethan was building, and soon the cracks in the facade that had been so carefully constructed would begin to show. Emma was about to face a choice, one that would change everything for her, for Roland, and for everyone around them. The affair that had started as a simple connection between a professor and his student was quickly becoming a tangled mess of emotions, lies, and dangerous consequences. The pressure on Emma became unbearable as her two worlds collided. Roland's increasing insistence on spending time together and Ethan's growing concerns began to weigh heavily on her. She had tried to keep her interactions with Roland strictly academic, but it was becoming impossible. Roland had crossed a line and she knew it. His possessiveness had become too much to ignore. The subtle control he exerted over her was suffocating, and Emma had begun to feel trapped in a situation she didn't know how to escape. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting with Roland, Emma found herself standing in the courtyard, feeling as though she couldn't breathe. She had just spent an hour with him in his office discussing her latest paper, but the conversation had shifted, as it always did, toward more personal matters. Roland had praised her work, as usual, but there was an edge to his compliments that made Emma uneasy. His words, once encouraging, now felt like a form of manipulation. The subtle way he would remind her how much she depended on him, how he had helped her so much, was no longer comforting. It was controlling. Emma had tried to pull away, but Roland had insisted on walking her to her next class, making her feel obligated to comply. It was a gesture that felt less like care and more like ownership. She had felt suffocated during their walk, the weight of his presence pressing in on her, and once she was alone in the courtyard, she had to stop and gather herself. It wasn't just the academic pressure anymore. It was the emotional strain that came with being tied to Roland's every expectation. She had started to resent him, but at the same time, she was afraid of what might happen if she pushed him away completely. His influence over her had grown so insidious that she didn't know where the lines between professional and personal ended anymore. When Emma met up with Ethan later that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Ethan had been quiet, his usual jokes replaced with concerned glances. He had noticed the change in her, how distant she had become, how her eyes were clouded with something she couldn't name. Emma wanted to tell him everything, to admit that she had been hiding a secret from him, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't bear the thought of disappointing him. Ethan was kind and had shown her a love that made her feel safe, but Roland was something else entirely. He had an emotional hold on her, one that she didn't understand, and now it seemed impossible to break free from him. The tension between Emma and Ethan reached a breaking point one evening when they were walking back to her dorm after a late study session. Ethan had asked her about Roland again, and this time Emma couldn't dodge the question. Ethan's voice was soft, but there was a seriousness to it that made her pause. He wanted to know why she had been so distant, why she seemed so preoccupied all the time. Emma didn't know how to answer him. She wanted to tell him that Roland's attention was becoming overwhelming, that it was turning into something dangerous. But the fear of losing him, of revealing the truth about her secret relationship with Roland, made her stay silent. Ethan had seen the hesitation in her eyes, and the hurt began to show in his voice. He confronted her, asking if there was someone else, if there was something going on between her and Roland. It was the first time he had spoken of it so directly, and it hit Emma like a slap in the face. She felt a surge of guilt and confusion wash over her. She wanted to deny it, to say it was nothing more than a professional relationship, but she knew it wasn't true. Roland had made her feel things she couldn't explain, things she shouldn't have felt. She had allowed herself to get pulled into a dangerous game, and now she was paying the price. In a moment of frustration, Emma pulled away, telling Ethan that it was complicated and that she couldn't explain it right then. The conversation ended with an uncomfortable silence, and Emma walked away, feeling the weight of her secrets pressing down on her more than ever. She knew she was losing Ethan, and a part of her resented herself for it. But she also knew that the damage had already been done. Roland had wormed his way into her life in a way that made it almost impossible to separate herself from him. Meanwhile, Roland was growing increasingly agitated by Emma's distance. He had always prided himself on being in control of his relationships, but with Emma, it felt as though he was losing his grip. He had noticed the way she had started to pull away, the way her responses had become more formal, more distant. It angered him. Emma had become more than just a student to him. She was a reflection of his own desires, a symbol of power and influence that he could not afford to lose. He had spent months subtly manipulating her, building her trust, and now she was slipping away from him. He couldn't let that happen. Roland's desperation grew as he became more fixated on Emma. He began showing up at her dorm unannounced under the guise of offering academic help. He would send her increasingly insistent messages asking why she hadn't responded to his texts, why she had been so cold in their last meeting. The more Emma pulled away, the more Roland pushed. He tried to maintain the illusion of being a mentor, but the underlying tension was impossible to ignore. Emma had become his obsession, and he would stop at nothing to keep her close. The situation was spiraling out of control. Emma was caught in a dangerous tug-of-war between Roland's suffocating hold on her and the genuine affection she had started to feel for Ethan. Each day felt like a new battle, and Emma was losing the fight to maintain her sanity. She had let herself become entangled in a situation that was now impossible to unravel, and with each passing moment, she could feel herself falling further into a trap she didn't know how to escape. The more Emma tried to distance herself from Roland, the more he seemed to tighten his grip, and the more she pushed Ethan away, the deeper she sunk into the emotional chaos that had become her life. She was on the brink of losing everything: the respect of her peers, the love of Ethan, and, most devastatingly, her own sense of self. The affair, though still unspoken, had begun to consume her, and soon the consequences of it all would come crashing down on her in ways she couldn't anticipate. The walls that Emma had built around herself were beginning to crumble, piece by piece. The weight of her secrets, the burden of her divided loyalties, had grown too heavy to bear. She couldn't outrun the consequences of her choices anymore. The lie she had been living was starting to unravel, and the truth was inevitable. It all came to a head on a cold evening in late November. Emma had just finished a long day of classes, her mind weighed down with 1,000 thoughts she couldn't quite organize. Roland had become more insistent than ever, sending her texts late at night, appearing unannounced in places where he knew she would be. The tension between them had escalated, and Emma could no longer pretend that things were fine. She had spent the last few weeks avoiding Roland as best as she could, but his presence was inescapable. His persistence had started to feel like a threat, and Emma realized she could no longer hide from the reality of what was happening between them. That evening, Emma went to meet Ethan, hoping to find some solace in his company. She had been trying to distance herself from him, afraid that she was already too far gone in her secret life with Roland, but Ethan had remained patient with her, sensing that something was wrong. As they sat in their usual spot at the small cafe near campus, Emma knew she couldn't keep pretending. The guilt had been eating at her for weeks, and the more she ignored it, the worse it became. Ethan had asked her, once again, about Roland. This time his voice wasn't just filled with concern, there was hurt in it, a quiet frustration that Emma couldn't ignore. His eyes were searching hers, waiting for her to speak, and in that moment, the truth felt like a crushing weight on her chest. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she finally admitted what she had been keeping from him all along. She told Ethan everything. She spoke of Roland's mentorship, the gradual shifts in their interactions, and the ways Roland had made her feel special, powerful, and at times confused. She described how their connection had blurred the lines of what was acceptable, how she had allowed herself to be pulled deeper into something she wasn't proud of. Ethan listened in stunned silence, his expression unreadable. When Emma finished, she braced herself for the storm she knew was coming. She had no idea what to expect, but the fear of losing Ethan was nearly overwhelming. To her surprise, he didn't shout or accuse her. Instead, he looked at her with quiet sadness, the hurt clearly written in his face. Ethan's voice was steady as he asked the one question Emma had been dreading. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emma had no good answer, no justification for what she had done. The only thing she could say was that she had been scared of what Roland might do if she rejected him, scared of what Ethan would think if he knew the truth. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew that it wasn't just fear that had kept her silent. It was a part of her that had wanted to continue the dangerous dance with Roland. She had let herself become swept up in the thrill of it, in the sense of power and attention he gave her, even as she knew it was wrong. Ethan stood up from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. Emma felt her heart sink. He wasn't angry, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He had been betrayed. The trust between them was shattered, and though he didn't say it, Emma knew that nothing would ever be the same again. He had given her his heart, and she had allowed herself to be consumed by a toxic relationship with Roland. Ethan didn't say goodbye that night. He simply walked away, leaving Emma in the cold, the cafe now a blur of distant chatter and fading warmth. Emma sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of her actions crashing down on her. She had lost Ethan, and now she realized she might lose everything else: her reputation, her future, and the control she once thought she had over her life. Roland, the very man who had lured her into this web of deceit, was now more dangerous than ever. Emma knew he wouldn't let her go easily. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, texts, and unanswered messages. Roland had started showing up at her dorm, his visits growing more frequent and more intense. He was becoming desperate. Emma had never seen him like this, his calm, intellectual demeanor now replaced with frustration and something darker, something possessive. She knew that Roland felt entitled to her attention, to her time, and as she distanced herself further, his behavior became more erratic. It was only a matter of time before Roland took things too far. One evening, as Emma was leaving the library, Roland cornered her in the stairwell. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to make her wince. His eyes, once filled with admiration, were now cold and calculating. He demanded that she explain her behavior, that she justify her rejection of him. Emma pulled away, her heart racing in panic. She realized with a sickening clarity that Roland wasn't just disappointed, he was enraged. He had no intention of letting her go, not without a fight. With trembling hands, Emma managed to free herself and ran, not stopping until she was safely inside her dorm. She locked the door behind her and sank to the floor, her body shaking with fear. She couldn't run anymore, not from Roland, not from the consequences of her actions. The affair, which had started so innocently, had spiraled out of control, and now it was threatening to destroy everything she had worked for. The consequences of her decisions were catching up with her in ways she had never imagined, and she wasn't sure she could survive the fallout. As the days passed, Emma realized that the only way to take control of her life again was to confront the mess she had made. She had to face Roland, face the people she had hurt, and take responsibility for the damage she had caused. But as the phone calls and messages from Roland continued, Emma knew one thing for sure: escaping him wouldn't be as easy as walking away. The affair had a life of its own now, and the road to redemption would be long and fraught with peril.